Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our guest, Adolpho Birch. Listeners, Adolpho is currently the Chief External and League Affairs Officer for the Tennessee Titans NFL football team, and previously he spent more than 2 decades working for the NFL in various roles. And as you may know, listeners, the NFL is one of the founding members of the Partnership for Clean Competition, and Adolpho is one of the PCC's Emeritus Board of Governors members. And today we'll be talking more about his work and also discussing the history and impacts of the PCC to continue our celebration of the PCC's 15th anniversary this year. So, Adolpho, we are so excited to welcome you to the show today. How are you?
I am doing well. Thank you for having me. This is exciting.
Well, we are thrilled to have you here and excited to learn from you today. So can you start by telling us a little bit more about yourself and your current role with the Tennessee Titans?
Sure. So I am, as you said, the Chief External and League Affairs Officer at the Titans. And primarily what I do is manage those relationships with our sort of key sets of stakeholders, whether that's city, state, or federal government, or Nashville community, or the league headquarters and our other teams and other leagues, things like that. It's really just designed to leverage the unique perspective that I have, having been born and raised in Nashville, but also having worked for the NFL for the 20 plus years that you mentioned earlier. So it's a great opportunity for me. Obviously, I came from the NFL headquarters where I had been doing really a number of different things that all touched in some way or another on the integrity of competition or the integrity of the game. And one of the probably most relevant of those things was to sort of help create, develop, and oversee the policies, in our case, on both performance-enhancing substances, but also substances of abuse, which you would consider to be street drugs.
Very cool. And this sounds like a dream position for you, being able to return sort of to your home stomping grounds there. But to think back about how you got to this position, Adolpho, how did you first become interested in sports law, and how did you ultimately find your way to where you are now?
The best way to describe it was a complete and utter accident.
I like that.
I was working in Houston for some law firms, and I was there at the time the Oilers ultimately decided to relocate to Nashville. And I had happened to do some work on the Oilers tangentially with respect to their stadium. And so I kind of knew the political landscape for the team's interactions with Houston and Texas. And I also, having been from Nashville and went to Vandy for law school, I knew the kind of the groups that were coalescing to try to get the deal actually done to get the Oilers to Nashville. So I reached out and tried to get on some sort of transition team, thinking, well, I know a little bit about both ends of it. It might be helpful. And that went exactly nowhere. But as a result, I think at some point I then got a call from the league headquarters in New York. And they said, well, we have this different job for you up here in New York. Would you be interested in it? And they started kind of walking through what it would entail. And it had really, by pure accident, been the case that I had experienced in all of the disparate things that they were looking for that I had no idea all kind of fit together to become this thing called Labor Relations Council at a professional sports league. So it was entirely by accident. And my fondness and love for the world of anti-doping and all that sort of came as an accidental result of all of that as well.
Oh, very cool. And were you an athlete yourself, or what was it about that drew you to sports law specifically?
I tell people that I played 3 sports in college, none of them well. I'm very proud of the fact the 3 sports that I had played none of them in high school. So that's my little claim to fame. Mm-hmm. But as I said, I wasn't particularly interested in sports law. I was more interested in politics, I think, for the most part of my career to that date. But like I think so many other people, the idea of sports law, when it started to become available, really became intriguing. And I will say, once I got in, I don't really see much of a reason that I would ever get out, because it is a highly enjoyable, and not only enjoyable to you as the practitioner, but you understand that it matters so much to everyone else. And it just is a difference maker from a community standpoint, from a national conversation standpoint. that it's both a huge honor, but also a huge burden. And once you get used to it, it's really difficult to consider yourself or picture yourself doing anything else.
Oh, well, Adolfo, it sounds like you are hooked. And as you alluded to, you began working for the NFL all the way back in 1997. So can you talk a little bit about what the landscape was like for anti-doping in football in those early years with the league and what policies were in place around that time?
Back then, I would say the NFL and the Olympic movement were really leading the pack sort of in consideration and thought about anti-doping, the rigorousness of the policies that were in place. And that's also largely because the perception of use among athletes in the NFL and among the Olympics that was probably the highest perception of use from a national conversation standpoint. So when I got there, the NFL had, relatively speaking, a very robust policy with a high degree of testing, quality laboratory, Olympic lab use, and other things, collections, other sort of key components of the system. But from my end, I started seeing fairly significantly and fairly quickly that there were a lot of things that could be done to really tighten the policy and get it in a better position. And so I sort of started on that really close to the time that I got there. It became kind of one of my early pet interests was to really focus on our policy and how it worked and trying to not only improve it from our internal perspective, but also to begin the idea of sharing information, getting best practices from other leagues, pushing other leagues to create as much harmonization as possible, working with the Olympic side to understand what they were doing and how they were trying to do it, reaching out to law enforcement, all the sorts of things that, we now sort of take advantage and take for granted are things that really were at the beginning stages when I kind of got there in 97. A lot of other leagues started to face a little scrutiny, and there were things that made the conditions right for really making broad step improvements across the board, not just for our league, but for sports generally.
Absolutely. And Adolfo, I can only imagine that it was really exciting to be able to work with an organization that was really a front runner in this movement at that time. Like you said, some of these important pieces were already in place when you got there in 1997. Back 10 years prior, in 1987, they had already started testing players for steroid use. In the late 80s, they also started the suspensions for players. Things like that were already there. And then you started refining and you sort of had a foundation to work with. So then what were some of the key changes that you've seen over the years as this program has evolved?
The one thing to me that I would first lead off with is what helped the NFL along was that we had player buy-in from the beginning. It was our players who raised their hands and said, we want to stop the threat of these performance-enhancing substances coming into our game. And that was a critical piece for us as a sort of foundational point, because you have to have the athlete as intimately invested in keeping the sport clean, understanding that sort of destructive value of coercive compulsion, because as we would always say in the substances of abuse world, the use of a narcotic by a player does not induce or compel another player to think they need to do it. But with performance-enhancing substances, that's exactly the case. So to have that buy-in and to have our athletes understand that you really have got to do this and be forceful about it and protect the interests of the, in our case, 1,800 clean players at the expense of the few who would violate, that was a critical piece that was already laid and in place. So from there, the things that I tried to do and the things that I think reflect sort of the growth over the years, we're really just trying to do one, simplify the system, whether that's collections, whether that's testing, whether that's how we deliver and administer the adjudication of violations. All of those things were ripe areas for really being able to think about it and come up with better, fairer, more cost-effective, and more comprehensive systems and methods that helped. The other thing I think that is one of the big things, which is probably why we're talking today, was to really get the rest of the industry, because it is a very niche sort of group of folks who need to understand about performance-enhancing substances, but really get all of them talking and everybody on the same page, everybody interacting on the laboratory and science end, to really see how we can best combine efforts where we can to reach a better result overall. Because a lot of this is really related to youth and young athletes and trying to make sure we're modeling that right image and preventing and giving awareness to kids who would otherwise think about doing what their idol does. And so for all of those things, the development of the PCC and others were outgrowths of that concerted effort.
Definitely. And I think founding the PCC was a really big step in getting some of these key stakeholders in the community talking. So can you talk a little bit more about how the NFL got involved in founding the PCC?
For us, we had been funding research sporadically over the years, trying to deal with questions that were coming up that we assumed were somewhat unique to us, or at least we didn't have any altruistic or broad-minded motives in trying to figure out some of those answers other than to resolve issues or fix what we thought were defects or deficiencies in how things were coming back on our end. But as some of these other leagues started to kind of develop some questions, it just became clear to me that we needed to pool and organize our efforts, particularly on the research end, because there was a lot going around at the time. There were questions about designer steroids and things that were undetectable, or just generally keeping up with those chemists who might want to find ways around our ability to test. So we really needed to come together and be rigorous about how we looked into the science in particular. And so the PCC was the perfect opportunity as we started to think about it and coalesce those groups together with USOC and others to say, let's all think about this and not duplicate effort, but let's exponentially enhance our effort by getting together and working as a team, so to speak.
Absolutely. Yeah, you brought up some really good points there. I think this idea that the problems you are facing with anti-doping were your problems alone is something that a lot of individuals in different spaces within the community might sort of have this perspective that they just need a quick solution to this particular problem that just they have. But actually, if you look at the bigger picture, a lot of people are facing the same challenges and problems in sport. So we touched on this a little bit, but from your perspective, Adolpho, why is it so important for the NFL to support the PCC in this anti-doping research that it funds?
I think the key piece to start is the whole idea that you have to stay ahead of those who would seek to undermine the point and impact of your policies. And that is a challenge that is an ongoing challenge, and it requires the foresight of league type folks to be able to translate that to science type folks, I guess if that's the way I would say it. So scientists and lab researchers and directors are extremely smart, but they have to understand what is going on in order to figure out how to think about those questions and understand what the science can do. So the PCC, its fundamental point is really to help generate what the issues are, to then give those science folks an idea of how to go about attacking it and trying to find solutions to that. So when it works well, the PCC is both an information provider and an information receiver, because those lab researchers and other tremendously important experts are often then able to see an issue and retranslate that into how that could be an issue with respect to anti-doping policies. And so then you get a nice virtuous circle about it. So for me, that's always the sort of number one aim. But the number two aim is to consistently try to think about ways to make it better, cheaper, easier, more effective. And that's primarily aimed at testing. But if you think of everything for what devices you're utilizing to collect specimens, what do the vials look like? What do the kits look like? Is this a cheaper and quicker kit? How long does it take for the labs to do the analysis? Well, if they do a research project for PCC that ultimately finds a new method that takes half the time and costs half the amount, then now we've improved anti-doping overall. Or if there are different sample types, effectively working on hair sampling, or effectively working on blood sampling, or effectively working on saliva, trying to do things that ultimately make it less invasive for our athletes, quicker for our athletes. All of those sorts of things are things that come out of PCC and things that will benefit not simply the members of PCC, but everyone. But the idea is that you will be able to be a part of that. If you are a part of PCC, you'll be on the front end. You'll understand what's going on. You'll be able to make offerings and suggestions for things that might be of interest to your group. And those sorts of things combined make it a really effective tool, which we have been ecstatic about at the NFL. So I strongly encourage it.
Fantastic. I know, as you mentioned, the PCC is really critical for having that research really grounded in the needs and the realities of leagues and sport organizations, because otherwise I think scientists sometimes you do some very cool but very impractical science that is not ultimately able to move onto that application stage.
And that works both ways, actually, because you have to think about, in the absence of a PCC, a researcher might have no interest in a particular subject. But when PCC can, again, translate that into, this is why this is extremely important to what is one of the most important industries in our world, then that degree of fascination can catch up with that researcher. And now it becomes something that they are interested in. And so, as I said, it's not simply the researchers assisting us. In a lot of ways, it's us assisting the researchers to point them toward topics that ultimately will prove very exciting to them, even if they did not realize it before we talked. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Finding those links, those ways that their work might be relevant to sport and opportunities that they didn't even think about in this space, I think is so cool. So let's talk about how the NFL and the PCC have worked together. We mentioned this is the 15th anniversary year of the PCC. So can you talk about how the organizations have worked together to really support anti-doping science?
The first and most important way is providing funding. The funding that the leagues and organizations that participate forms the basis for all this tremendous research is being done. So as an initial point, that's critical. And that was critical in the formation of the PCC in the first place. One of the initial things we were focused on at the PCC was human growth hormone and some of those derivatives. And to get to the point that we were able to ultimately find a way to test for it was a direct result of the funding for the various research projects that came in that started to little by little piece together how that could happen. And one research project would build off another research project, would build off another research project. And having the PCC there to apply scientific research standards and review to those projects, to those outcomes, is solely responsible for what the results have been able to be. Because that's really the hard part, is getting it from a thought in someone's head to peer review research that can form the basis for fundamental changes in how you look at some either testing or methodologies or things like that.
Absolutely. And I know you served on the board for a number of years as well and are now an emeritus member. Can you talk about your experiences being a representative on the board?
It was great. One of the beauties of it was the first part, when we first got it off the ground, we were trying to get it off the ground. And there was a lot, but we all were focused on it. 4 groups were trying to make sure we were setting it up for potential success. And we knew it would take time. We knew it would take funding and resources. But more importantly, we wanted to set up those systems. For example, like the Scientific Advisory Board, we knew that that was going to be critical. And to be able to find and attract the top researchers to be able to fill that board really put us in a position such that at some point they became really ultimately driving the show, and we could advise them, but it was their work that was going to move the needle and ultimately produce the results, which is how it should be. This is about research. This is about understanding what the research can do, and you need researchers to lead the pack on that. So that, to me, over the years, between setting up the systems to allow it to work smoothly and efficiently and stay ahead of the curve as much as we can, to the improved information sharing among the groups and improved relationships between the groups and law enforcement and government and other relevant stakeholders, that's kind of the legacy of the organization that I'm probably most proud of.
Absolutely. And I know the Board of Governors plays a key role in reviewing the research priorities and helping develop the content and planning for the PCC conferences. Can you talk about these experiences as well?
Oh, the conferences are great. I think that those do provide additional leverage and opportunity for people to come together and talk. And again, the information sharing is one of the key points, because you have to get a lot of these researchers, a lot of the folks that deal with the anti-doping policies on one end or another. You have to get them talking so that you can identify what the new opportunities are, what the new challenges are, and to begin thinking about what the solutions to those things could be. So I love them largely because it's a relatively niche set of folks. And the ability to spend 3 days talking about nothing but anti-doping. I'm a member of the Sports Lawyers Association as well. I'm on that board, and we might get one session out of the 4 days of the SLA conference might be devoted to some issue in anti-doping. And that's understandable because the industry is much broader than merely anti-doping. But to be able to have all of that concentrated, especially for those who have it as part of their portfolio, is really, really an exciting prospect and opportunity.
Absolutely. And Adolfo, you touched on just some of the different ways that the PCC interacts with stakeholders and partner organizations, whether it's the conference, these board meetings, things like that. What really makes these PCC interactions with their partner organizations and the collaborations between them unique, do you think?
Well, I think it is probably partly the nature of the relationship itself. One, everybody knows the PCC is designed from the beginning to be an effective, impartial, science-based reflection of the work that comes out of it. So that, I think, establishes a level of credibility, not simply within the anti-doping community, but outside of it. The anti-doping community does have to pay attention to other stakeholders, and I think that those stakeholders, such as local and state and federal governments and law enforcement and others, look at the PCC, understand that whatever's coming out of it is credible, science-based, and designed ultimately with the goal of being a more effective and fairer process at the end of the day. So that is the level of interaction to start. Then you have the interaction within the various components of PCC. So all of the various leagues and others who send representatives or come to conferences, or even broader groups. You think about folks that have an interest, but perhaps not thought about in the traditional sense, such as folks involved in horse racing. They have a lot of the same issues. I'm a commissioner for the National Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority. And part of what we're doing is really trying to harmonize the broad disparity in testing and enforcement policies for horse racing, thoroughbred horse racing across the country. And a lot of it reminds me of a lot of what goes on in PCC. So one of my views was always that PCC has room for all of that. The idea of research, the idea of scientifically backed analysis can apply as broadly as we have the imagination and foresight to allow.
Absolutely. And I think your response really highlights that it's not only these connections with the PCC, it's not only the connections with scientists, but also these others in the sport and anti-doping community, whether it's the other PCC partners like MLB, USOPC, USADA, the PGA Tour. So can you talk a little bit about what it was like to actually be connected with and to work with these other organizations through the PCC?
I think it was immensely helpful for my role in addressing the NFL's policies in particular, to be able to listen and understand the issues that were impacting other sports that may or may not have anything to do with ours. Because it allowed you to stress test what you were thinking about. It allowed you to provide information that was perhaps helpful if you had best practices. Obviously, as you said, we had been kind of ahead of the curve in terms of really forming and developing our policies out. So there might have been things that I was able to provide information to stop a potential mistake that we learned through unfortunate means, perhaps. So just to have that level of interaction, have everybody there be someone who is keenly and profoundly cognizant of the impact of sport, the impact of having a solid anti-doping policy, and what that means, as I said, not only for your athletes or your sport, but for youth and young athletes and others who benefit from the example that sports sets. So I enjoy all of them. I still talk to most of the folks that were part of those leagues that were part of that PCC experience while I was there.
Absolutely. I mean, I think sport and anti-doping are really exciting fields to work in because they're so dynamic. Like you alluded to earlier, things are always changing. You're trying to stay ahead of the cheaters and people who might be developing new methods and new substances to dope. And this can be a challenge. So, Adolfo, what do you view as one of the biggest challenges that we are currently facing in anti-doping?
I would probably go back to kind of what I touched on earlier. I think the biggest challenge is to continue to find ways to do the testing better, to make it cheaper, to make it faster, to make it less invasive, and to get your results and your adjudication out and dealt with as quickly and as fairly as possible. So to me, that undergirds everything that the organization should be trying to do, because that should be a continuing quest. We should not get to a point where we believe that this way is fine and there can't be any improvement on it. I think it's really about education and awareness. PCC does a great deal of that. But educating the public, educating youth, educating young athletes about all of these issues, I'd say that's probably challenge too, because in this age of social media and other variety of inputs and your ability to limit your inputs to the things that you wish to hear,
right,
it can be difficult to get through to someone who is getting bad information or getting misinformation, or in some cases getting accurate information that allows them to do things that they probably shouldn't do, to find ways to break through that chain and get to them with what would be the more scientific, more rigorous and factual research and data. I think that's probably the second biggest challenge, I would say.
Absolutely. I agree. I think this ease of information dissemination is a double-edged sword sometimes, that you sometimes feel like it's working to your benefit, but also to your detriment in some cases. And I love the idea of this continual quest to enhance efficiencies in education across the board. I think it's so important in anti-doping. And I know the PCC has contributed in some ways to these efforts. So in your opinion, Adolpho, what are some of the biggest impacts that the PCC has had on anti-doping in these first 15 years of the organization?
Well, you're putting me on the spot on that one, but
I know.
I will make an effort. I would say, obviously, the development and rollout of the growth hormone testing was probably the single biggest. And then I would probably say some additional ones would be the development of new methods for testing substances that we already knew about that has greatly enhanced the effectiveness of those tests. I think there's been a great deal of work PCC has done that probably people don't think about, which is the development of the pipeline of laboratory researchers and lab directors who have an interest in sports and anti-doping related testing. Because it was one of the things we identified early on was that it's really important to find people who want to look at this as their area of interest. So being a direct part of that through some of the fellowships and other things that PCC has been able to set up, that is the bet on the future. And I think it may go unsaid, but that may be one of the more important things that's gone on. Other than those two things, I would say some of the things on advancements in, let's say, blood spot analysis to get away from the need to do venipunctures and things to obtain blood specimens, looking at saliva, looking at the hair vectors. All of those things are going to be things that, as they become routine, will have a great impact on not only anti-doping generally, but potentially to other industries, other outputs as well.
Well, absolutely. I think there have been a lot of exciting successes coming out of the PCC's work historically, but to think about the future here, Adolpho, what are your thoughts on the role that the PCC will play in the field of anti-doping going forward? And perhaps are there any specific goals or priorities that you would personally like to see the organization focus on?
I think PCC's mandate and mission is well set, well honed. I would simply hope that it continues to look for avenues and means of improving upon the methods and the varying aspects of anti-doping that we have. That should be its primary suit, and to develop future researchers and analysts and others who take interest in this industry and take interest in sport and understand the importance of it. I do think it is a continuation of the things that the organization has already carved out for itself and simply trying to continue to make it better.
Absolutely. I like the better, cheaper, easier, faster, more effective mantra. We'll use that going forward. Well, Adolpho, thank you so much for chatting with me about your experiences. And I guess for listeners out there who might be interested about the PCC, do you have a message that you would like to share with other, whether it's sports organizations, NADOs, or others who might want to become supporters of the PCC?
I guess I would say don't be a free rider. Join us and you will reap the reward internally and collectively. It is something that is critical. It is something that is a useful organization that you will benefit from whether you participate or not, but your participation will improve the organization. Your participation will improve your organization. So that probably would be the only thing I would say. Get in the game. Don't sit on the sideline.
I like it. And I know resources are often a limiting factor when it comes to anti-doping science and just anti-doping in general. So if we took away the barriers that would normally hold you back, Adolpho, and you had everything you could possibly dream of, is there one particular problem in anti-doping that you would most want to solve?
Collection. I'd want to figure out how to do it and do it in a way that is far less invasive than it currently is for our athletes. When I was at the NFL, the commissioner and I would always get tested so that we could clearly understand exactly what it's like to have to provide your specimens and those sorts of things. And I think if we can get to a point where it is as simple as a saliva test across the board or a blood spot analysis or something that makes that process of collection, both from an identification and chain of custody and all of those things, if we could just figure out a way to do that, then that would have been the best way I could imagine spending my unlimited resources, which you just gave me.
I like it. I think that's definitely one of the holy grails in the field. And Adolpho, is there anything else from your experiences with the PCC or the NFL that you'd like to share with listeners today?
I wish everybody the most success, particularly those who have, it is sometimes a thankless job to be in the anti-doping world. But I wish everybody success, and hopefully your challenges are few.
I like it. Wonderful note to end on. And if our listeners want to learn more about you and your work, what is the best way for them to do so?
You can start at TennesseeTitans.com, maybe, and they'll give you a little information about me, or I think I'm on most of that social media stuff one way or the other. Mm-hmm. So from there, I'm sure that you'll find a little bit that may pique your interest, and maybe that'll lead you to something else.
Phenomenal. Well, listeners, definitely get connected with Adolpho. Check out that website for the Tennessee Titans. And Adolpho, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And listeners, wonderful to have you here with us as well. And if you haven't had a chance already, it would mean a lot to all of us at the PCC if you could rate and review our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and/or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.